Okay, so this is our book club discussion of Teaching to Transgress, Education as the Practice of Freedom by Bell Hooks. When we first wanted to sort of talk about the major themes in the book, does somebody want to start talking about themes?
I'll start. One of my big takeaways from teaching to transgress was definitely the idea of inclusion and diversity, but I feel this book at least hit me differently than any other discussion or book on inclusion and diversity ever has. It really taught me that rather than just discussing what diversity is, what inclusion is, it really taught me, or it really opened my eyes to how to actually include in the classroom. I really liked all of Bell Hooks's like different stories about her experiences, especially at Stanford, how she knew that she belonged, but there were not people like her at Stanford, and all the experiences that she went through, all the struggles, that just really opened my eyes to what diversity and inclusion really looks like from an other perspective.
Yeah, and to kind of expand on what you talked about, I think the biggest thing she continued to hint at was how to critically analyze things while keeping in mind diversity in the back of your mind as you continue to go through those things. Because she talked about these specific topics like feminism or anything like that, and she mentioned like how certain students felt like they shouldn't speak up at that point in time, or like their opinion didn't matter. But she taught like everyone's opinion matters, and you just have to be careful about what you say while critically analyzing something.
Yeah, I think what really was impactful to me is kind of debunking the myth of multiculturalism. Like, I think that all of us were taught in school about this like ideal of society where everyone should be treated exactly the same, and we're all just human beings, and we shouldn't even like think about those differences, and as long as no one is actively like racist, then everything is fine. And like you can just go from the old system to a neutral system, and that's enough. And you know, Bell Hooks really really rejects that idea, and in talking about like how I mean, she starts off by talking about the difference for her moving from a like segregated Black school
Right.
to an integrated school, and how it ultimately was a lesser educational experience. And ultimately, like, it seems like she would have preferred to stay in the segregated Black school because at least the people there, like, they understood her, and the teachers looked like her, and they had a fundamentally different philosophy about what teaching meant.
Yeah.
I think kind of building off of that too, Hooks brings up this idea, this concept of engaged pedagogies, and sort of really being able to address those, I want to say like culture shocks that she kind of faced when she went from that segregated school to an integrated school. And then sort of, I guess, and this kind of builds off of what everybody said so far, and that having this, like being able to know who you are, but having like an actual critical analysis of who you are and like the privileges that come with it, or the structures that are already in place, the infrastructures that are already in place when it comes to education, those sort of things too, and like how really challenging that is the only way to truly get like this freedom and this space to like learn and sort of approach and push past whatever those boundaries are.
Yeah, I think she just made it pretty blatant and obvious that the reality is that like we all have biases. We all bring those bias in the classroom. And the only way that we can actually move past those instead of just ignoring them and saying something like we don't see race, you have to confront your bias and be able to understand how you can teach while having that bias.
Right.
Yeah, and we're all talking about like topics that are like pretty like serious and stuff, and like she leaves like no stone unturned throughout the book. But I think looking at it broadly, what I took away from it mainly was that it just has this feeling of optimism throughout. Like she she could like look at all these challenges and be sort of nihilistic about all of it, but she chooses to look at what like education inside the classroom can be, despite all like contemporary like educators having like these views towards, like Valerie said, multiculturalism, and like society's brain is obviously wired one way, but she chooses to just look at what everything can be.
And I think
If we all,
that optimism came from the fact that she continues to preach. Like the biggest thing I talked about was education as a practice of freedom. And so her optimism was that as long as you educate yourself and you continue to work on that, the possibilities are endless.
That reminded me of one of my favorite quotes from the book. Was, let me see, this is excuse me, this is about her time at Stanford, and it says, even though students enter the democratic classroom believing they have the right to free speech, most students are not comfortable exercising this right to free speech. Most students are not comfortable exercising this right, especially if it means that they must give voice to thoughts, ideas, feelings that go against the grain, that are unpopular. And that resonated with me, because I think we've all been in that classroom. We've all been in situations where maybe we don't feel like we can speak up, we should speak up, we should kind of just go with the flow. And I think this is kind of going to a new topic, but speaking to what Reggie was just talking about of, you know, school and education as freedom, that this book really discussed how, yes, we are going to be teaching our students curriculum and teaching them what they need to know, but that we are really giving our students a voice and teaching them how to be citizens, how to be people, how to stand up for the others, stand up for what's wrong, and not be afraid to use their voice. So I loved that quote, because we should empower our students to ask questions, to disagree, to debate in a healthy way and hopefully not offensive way. But, you know, if we can monitor it and control it a little bit, you know, there might be some angsty discussions our students are going to have.
From kind of what, again, just building off of that, and I think this idea of optimism, is that I feel like everywhere that Hooks goes in her these 10 chapters, really has, excuse me, not these 10 chapters, there's 14 of them, but really has this idea of like compassion behind everything that she does. And it's nothing is ever meant to be, I want to say, aggressive or like biting by any means, but at the same time too, like you can't really push into some of these like really freeing discussions, like these really critical discussions that take you out of everything around you and focus you in on learning, without the ability to actually look at some of these really sensitive topics. So when you bring a discussion to those sensitive topics, how are you going to react? You know, you don't want to be brash, you don't want to be assuming, you don't want to be exclusionary. You know, you want to be inclusive, and you want to have that compassion. You want to have the ability to bring freedom for everybody in that classroom, I think.
Yeah, I think a lot. I mean, I think that a lot of people, you know, people talk about like this idea of tone policing, where people are trying to shut down a conversation based on how that argument is being made, like saying that someone is too angry, and are just trying to stir things up. And I think like there's a difference between someone telling you that you have to have a civil conversation, and I don't think that bell hooks would agree that, you know, you have to be civil at all times,
Right.
but she still is coming from this place of like ultimately empathy. I think she empathizes a lot with the people who are trying. You know, in currently, I think there are a lot of people who are afraid to actually try and engage with ideas because they're afraid of saying the wrong thing and being like attacked for
Yeah.
not already knowing.
Right.
And I think that, Belle talks about how what was really important at her university was, having these spaces for these like older white teachers to really like talk about these issues and I don't want to call it a safe space, but a space where like they would be able to say the wrong thing without being attacked for it,
Right.
and building understanding. And so I think that that is something that really sets her apart from a lot of other people who are calling for a really radical change to how we do education.
Yeah, like if we're like the commune of freedom that she talks about the entire book wanting the classroom to be like, that's not just going to happen without like all of you have said, or like a lot of you have touched on, like not being comfortable, or it's not going to happen without us being uncomfortable, and just having students be active participants towards like classroom success. Like that's not going to come without those types of conversations, those types of failures, you could even call it, in the classroom. It's just going to be like an active process to revolutionize education as it is in the classroom.
So to kind of tie Valerie's point and Theo's point together, just in regards to having like teachers have that safe space and having the classroom become that safe space, there was a really interesting quote in the book that I just enjoyed so much that I wrote it down. It was in chapter 10, in which she says, "It is crucial that critical thinkers who want to change our teaching practices talk to one another, collaborate in a discussion that crosses boundaries, and create a space for intervention." So I think that's probably where both of your thoughts are coming from. And I just thought that quote was impactful enough to mention, because I do think in order for us to make progress when it comes to education and figuring out how best to educate such a wide variety of people, we do have to talk to each other about what does and what doesn't work. And part of that has to be being able to understand that like people have different ideas, and you don't have to agree with all their ideas, but their ideas might possibly work better. So you should probably at least try them.
In that same chapter, at the like very end of chapter 10, she has a quote that says, "Being a teacher means being with people." And I think that that encapsulates all of it, right? Like you can't have these assumptions of people. You got to realize that everybody's going to be different and have their own stories and have their own backgrounds, where they come from, experiences, and all that stuff too. So
Yeah, and I think that goes back to like, even though we're around people, we also have to be supportive of the students that we're around, because a lot of them do look for us for that type of supportive structure. And that can be educationally speaking, but also most of the time it does involve things outside of education, like real life issues and stuff like that. So I just wanted to mention that also.
yeah.
Um,
Go ahead, Theo.
Yeah, I think it's that same chapter where she talks about going to, I believe it was a conference, and she critique, it was very prominent
I think you're right.
Black author, but she talks about meeting one of her lifelong friends there, who is a white male, and she talked about connecting with him and talking to him, and how he had privileges as being white and a man, where she had privilege as being a higher, having a higher ranked title at her university compared to his. And I just found that really interesting about just connecting with different people with different experiences and different life experiences in the teaching profession. And like we've all said, like that's really how you build the community and see how everyone does what they do.
So we've kind of touched on this a little bit, and we're pushing into it. And I just wanted to sort of make like a clear segment so that when Christopher is watching that. So yeah, let's talk about ways to actually apply that to teaching and everything that we've taken now from this, whether it be chapter 10, which it sounds like a lot of us really looked into. And again, just like everything else that she talks about with the engaged pedagogies, with freedom in the classroom, all that stuff too.
Well, the one biggest thing I thought about was the different ways that we have to be equitable to our students. She wrote a quote about something like class was more than just a question of money, that it shaped values, attitudes, social relations, and biases, and so on and so forth. And that one just really hit me because I see a lot of that involved in our students on a day-to-day basis, whether or not one has the financial beings to have a phone versus another one not having a phone, and then like that person getting shunned because they don't have a phone yet. And so then those same factors come to play, especially in this situation where there's a pandemic and students are at home without laptops and stuff like that. And so we have to find other ways to reach out to them and do our best just to be equitable and fair when it comes to how we interact with them.
I think it's really important for something that she points out is that, students, when they go into the classroom, it's not like they, shed 90% of who they are and just become students. Like, you always are bringing like your whole self and your history and your traumas even into the classroom with you. And I think that a lot of people assume this like disconnect between like your academic self and the rest of you, and one of those is appropriate to bring into the classroom and one of them is not seen as appropriate. But like, I think that by ignoring those other aspects of our students, like, we do them a disservice, right? Like, not everyone is able to completely shed all of their baggage when they come into the classroom. And that can really prevent them from being able to make use of the education that they're receiving in your classroom. Um, and so just like really uh, recognizing that your students are bringing their whole self into the classroom, but also at the same time you are. I think there's an even greater expectation that there's a divide between our professional self and our personal self. And we should always just be our professional self in the classroom and ignore everything else. And I mean, there's something to be said, of course, for acting in a professional manner. I'm not saying that we should abandon all of those norms. But we are also people with history and trauma and baggage that we're bringing into the classroom. And I think that if we can be gentle and kind with ourselves, that ultimately will allow us to do the same thing for our students.
Another thing I took away from it was she just spent a lot of time talking about the different ways students learn. And so part of that is that as educators, we have to understand that we need to be able to teach in different ways. And a lot of that goes back to being able to collaborate with coworkers and better understand like how to accommodate all of our students. When I thought of that, I specifically thought about the high amount of special ed students my school has, and we have to do a lot of working with their case managers and the special ed teachers in order to figure out how to manage or change this assignments so it's something that they're able to still learn from, but they're also able to actually do, and it's within their realm of understanding.
Yeah, she spent a good chunk of a chapter really discussing, cooperation and collaboration between teachers, between students and teachers. And that's something that I want to focus on as a teacher, is really harvesting that collaboration, because I think it can really only breed improvement and also challenge. It does take a strong moderator to allow group discussion and collaboration in some instances, but students can learn a lot from each other that they can't just learn from us standing in front of a classroom talking. So especially with some of these tougher topics, if I'm a social studies person, so if it's going to be slavery or politics or class or those kind of things, I think it's important for students to be able to hear each other's perspectives as long as we can make sure it's within a healthy environment.
I think kind of a lot of people have touched on this too. I think just this general sense of acknowledgement of your students. I know that in like my personal experience right now, I work like half in a school and half like online with some of my students. And when I leave the school, like I was just trying to like give them like the elbow bump and then sort of like letting students know that they're there and that somebody sees that they're there and that somebody wants them there. And I think that extends to a lot of facets of education, right? When you look at trying to be equitable, I realize that those like elbow bumps don't really fight any sort of systemic change or any sort of issues like that. But starting there and building towards that relationship with those students where they feel like they're comfortable, but they feel like they can share, you know, having that healthy group discussion that Kelly was talking about is so important.
And one of the things, just to kind of add on to that, it's just like we have to pay attention to our students, because the students that know you care about them are the ones that are more likely to work harder in your classes. So it can be beneficial to build that relationship with students before even trying to teach them. I actually had one teacher tell me that she spends a whole first week just trying to get to know students, and it's all just conversation starters and so on and so forth, just so they can understand each other's background and where each other comes from before they ever start teaching. So they at least have a basic understanding of each other's needs and what each other expects and wants from those classes. So I think that's something that we should also try to work on. And I definitely will be taking that into my teaching practice as well. And then one of the interesting things that I wanted to bring along with that is because I spoke with an ELL teacher. He doesn't know any other languages, but he allows the students to speak or respond to his questions in other languages just so they can feel most comfortable in that environment. And so little accommodations like that, even though he doesn't know what they're necessarily saying, it allows them to feel more comfortable and create a closer relationship with them.
And I think, just jumping off what you both said, the book as a whole, and especially the final chapter, is just Bell Hooks is making the case to teachers and educational professionals why they should change their pedagogy and make it ever evolving. Like Zach, you just making sure you hit elbows with students and stuff, like, might not seem like a lot, but those are the types of things. And then, yeah, just letting students be themselves, have that freedom. I just love that she just takes the time to make the case of like why we need to do this, why we should do this, and why we need to do this.
I guess I had one last question, one last statement, and it's one of the topics that Hooks brings up is sort of, so we've talked a lot about engaging with students, but how do we engage with sort of the academic structures around us? And I think that becomes part of this idea that teachers are growing too, and that if you want to actually, like, how do we actually make these safe spaces happen, or how do we make these free classrooms? And so it sounds like it can't just be with us, you know, it can't just be one room. It has to be something that a student can take from one classroom to the next. And so how are you making sure that you are being an example for other teachers, for your colleagues, right? And how are you also learning from your other colleagues? What are you taking from them to make sure that your student is getting, I don't want to say the same experience from one classroom to the next, but consistent quality of experience from one classroom to the next?
Well, I think honestly part of it is if you can implement this kind of model like in your classroom, if you can make your classroom a better environment for your students, it is something that hopefully would get noticed by like administrators, assistant principals, and the like. but I think we all know that that's not necessarily the case. The best people don't always just rise to the top and get noticed.
Right.
And so I think it's really important that we learn how to advocate for ourselves and our students when working with administrators. I think that if you are always, giving it your best every day, and like these are the like competence is something that, even if it's not the flashiest thing, it is something that most smart people will notice about you. And I think that if you can do that and convince uh, the people who have more power than you in your school that what you're doing works and it's effective, and if you can show those results, then you can work with them to kind of spread that around. Uh, when I was teaching in Dallas last year, the entire 2 weeks of before school started, when we were doing professional development, half of them were run by the other teachers in the school. And because they had done something really great, and they were able to show that to administrators, and then were allowed to, spread that kind of knowledge around. Um, and so, part of it is political, making sure that your ideas are getting heard and they're being delivered effectively, is a huge part of changing school culture, because ultimately you only have direct control over your own classroom.
Yeah, I think you were hinting at it at the end of it. Like the biggest thing is that we as teachers need to open our doors and learn and understand how to collaborate each other. And I literally mean open our doors, because most teachers decide they just want to close the door and teach, and it's going to be their way, and that's how they know, and that's all they're going to stick to. I think that's very damaging to a student's experience, and it's even more traumatic to the teacher's experience and growth as a teacher, because obviously we should always be reaching out to each other, helping each other figure out how best to teach assignments and how we can do things differently, because there's always a better way.
Right.
Any other thing to add, or do we want to maybe wrap up?
This is kind of like along the application standpoint. After reading this book, I felt super empowered. I was like, man, I'm going to go into my classroom. I'm going to get to these students. Their lives are going to be totally different. And then I kind of stopped and thought a little bit, like, as much as Bell Hooks spends, as much time as she spends in this book talking about how we can empower our students, how we can teach to transgress, how we can teach them to sometimes almost have a little element of disrespect. How do I implement that in my classroom effectively, not rub administration and the rest of my teachers the wrong way, but still give my students that space to question, to discuss, to grow? And I think there's probably a lot of districts out there that would really not like this attitude, that they don't want their teachers to push their students to this kind of learning, push their students into this kind of classroom, that you might kind of be the black sheep of the family if you bring this style of teaching into your classroom. So that's just what I took away, that's what I thought of the most with this book, is that Bell Hooks teaches us how important we can be as teachers, what we're going to bring to the table for our students, what options we're going to give them. And it's empowering, but also a little bit scary for me. So.
I think ultimately, this is one of those things that really sets teaching as a profession apart from other jobs. Like most jobs, you can just get by. You can show up and you can do enough to get by, and then you can go home, and then the day is over. You leave your work at work. But as teachers, I think that there's always a immediate like consequence to not doing your best, like right in front of you. Every single minute in the classroom is precious, and that's time that you can't ever get back. And I think that as long as we remember that and we keep that mindset of always pushing ourselves further and further and improving our practice, I mean, you can philosophically disagree with how a teacher is doing their job all day, but at the end of the day, if they are showing results and they are clearly like turning it out every single day and doing their jobs, like you can't really have, you don't have as strong of a foot to stand on to say like, oh, well, I think that you should do things differently. As long as what you're doing is clearly working, most administrators are just, they're going to have to just suck up the differences and wave them aside. And so I think that is the best way to be able to implement these like ideas in the classroom, is to just always be on the top of your game. Of course, it's easier said than done.
I think that's interesting that you brought up results, because one of the biggest things I struggled with after reading this book, because she talks about a lot of different ways to get these perfect results. And the reality of it is that being a teacher, you don't necessarily get results right away, because you can't, at the end of the school year, just be like, oh, this student is a perfect student and they're going to be a perfect citizen and contribute perfectly to the world. Like, the reality is, like, maybe they learned something, but like you can't necessarily see how your teaching method was applicable until years down the line. So that was just one of the things that I kind of struggled with it after, was like maybe I'm doing all of these things, but how do I know it's going to get the results I want without it being 5-10 years down the line? And talking back to students who've changed my life, because she brought up several examples of students from her past that like she reconnected with, and they'd said like they'd learn a lot from the class. And I was like, as a beginning teacher, that's hard for me to understand and relate to.
Yeah, when I said results, I meant the results that that administrator would respect. Like that 5 years down the line, like most administrators, like if they're the kind of administrator who's going to push back on this kind of teaching, they're not going to care about that. They're not going to care about whether a student 5 years later comes back and saying, oh my God, you changed my life. So you need to recognize what it is that they expect from you and always be as effective as possible in delivering the results they want. And the rest will the rest won't matter to them anyway. So I mean, if you have an administrator who test scores is their bread and butter, the only thing they care about, then you better be doing everything you can to make sure that those results are good, so you can justify the rest of class that you're doing, the rest of your work, because like that's ultimately, you know, how you get by, like in any job.
Right.
We're running right around about a half hour right now. So I'm just gonna, Theo, did you want a chance to add anything at the end?
I was just gonna say, going off something Kelly said earlier, like the book as a whole, it makes me nervous and it gives me anxiety, but it also makes me excited. And it makes me want to get in the classroom. That's just what it did. I loved it a lot.
So, Christopher, did you make it this far? I'm curious to hear.
Right. Right. Cool. So yeah, with that, then we'll wrap it up. And yeah, send the video on over. So.
All right. That's good.
Have a good night, everyone.